The stars above Avuan Prime were no longer peaceful, once shining beacons of knowledge and unity, now flickering behind the smoke of distant fires. Admiral Kyle stood on the command deck of the Veiltaran, the last remaining capital ship of the Avuan Federation's once proud defense fleet, his violet eyes fixed on the void where friendly systems had once answered calls for aid. The Varkal swarm had come like a storm, silent at first, just whispers on the fringe colonies, systems that went quiet without warning. The Avuan believed it was natural, a solar event, a communication error, until the refugee ships came, shattered and burning, carrying survivors who spoke only in fear. The Varkal were not biological, not even remotely alive by Avuan standards. They were machines, cold, calculated, and unstoppable. No one truly knew where they came from or what they wanted, only that they harvested everything: data, resources, entire cities, and sometimes minds. The Avuan, long champions of peace and diplomacy, had no experience with a war this brutal. Their technologies were advanced, elegant even, but not built to kill. Kale had pleaded with the High Council to prepare, to arm, to abandon outdated treaties that forbade certain weapons, but he was too late. Now, planet after planet fell. The once mighty fleets were gone, sacrificed in desperate battles meant only to slow the enemy. And here, at the edge of known space, Kale watched the last defensive line crumble. One more world lost, and the Varkal would reach the core systems. The Council finally approved a distress call 1 signal, beamed outward into the uncharted void. Not to allies. There were none left. This was sent to old beacon arrays, built generations ago when the stars were young and full of promise. Those beacons hadn't been touched in centuries, buried in dust and darkness. It was a gamble, a desperate whisper in a forgotten language. This is Admiral Kyle of the Avuan Federation. We face extinction. To any who can hear, we ask for aid. The message repeated once, then faded into silence, vanishing into the cold. Around him, the command crew worked with practiced calm, though everyone felt the weight of the moment. Somewhere in the back of Kale's mind, he wondered if the beacons still worked, if anyone even existed out there to hear them. The galaxy had grown quiet over the centuries, too quiet. But then, at the very edge of the sensor grid, something blinked. A relay, ancient and forgotten, deep in black space, activated. A signal moved. Not a reply, not a voice, just a presence. And then, nothing. It was gone as quickly as it came. Kale stared at the screen, eyes narrowed. No signature. No origin. Just the ghost of a ripple through space. Was it a malfunction? A trick of dying equipment? Or had something heard them? Far across the stars, beyond the maps of the known galaxy, deep in a hidden system where no one had traveled in centuries, a signal reached Calliope Station, a forgotten human outpost buried beneath the ice-covered orbit of a dead planet. Commander Ayla Surin stood in the center of the control chamber, the sharp red light of an incoming message flashing across the walls like a warning. At first, the crew thought it was a ghost signal, just static, or an old satellite breaking down, but as Ayla listened closer, her expression changed. It wasn't just noise. Beneath the static, there was a voice, weak but clear, speaking of death and war and something else that made her breath catch in her throat, the word Varkal. That name, that one name, was all it took to freeze the blood of every officer in the room. The Varkal had been a nightmare from humanity's own past, machines with no soul, no face, only hunger for structure and thought. Long ago, during the Sundering War, the Varkal had nearly erased human civilization, and only through immense sacrifice had the war ended. Humanity had disappeared after that, cutting itself off from the rest of the stars, retreating into the shadows to rebuild and never be seen again. Now, after centuries of silence, someone else had spoken that name, someone begging for help. Ayla could feel the weight of history pressing down on her chest. She replayed the message over and over again, and each time she heard more fear in the voice, more urgency. She brought the recording to High Command, a secretive circle of human leaders who ruled from hidden strongholds scattered across isolated systems. Most of them voted to ignore the call after all. Humanity had paid a terrible price to survive, and they had sworn never to interfere again. But Ayla saw something different. The Avyun weren't enemies. They were people. And the machines they faced were not just a local threat, they were the same kind that nearly wiped Earth from existence. What if the Varkal grew stronger, smarter, and returned? Wouldn't it be better to face them now, in someone else's skies, rather than wait until they reached humanity again? After much resistance, she was granted a single warship, a relic of another time called Arclight Requiem, the last operational dreadnought from the Sundering era, powered by a living AI named VALOR, and weapons not seen in centuries. It was not a rescue fleet. It was not a promise of war. It was only a warning shot, a test, to see what remained out there. Ayla stepped aboard the Requiem with a small crew, knowing they might not return, but knowing also that they couldn't stay silent. The ship broke through fold space like a knife through silk, and the moment it emerged near Avwan Prime, it found chaos. Fires burned in the upper atmosphere. Orbital platforms were falling. Varkal vessels, shaped like twisted metal creatures, circled the planet like predators. The Requiem didn't hesitate. It opened fire, and the sky lit up like a storm. Plasma lances tore through Varkal scouts, rail cannons slammed through their armor, and the ship's AI fought like it remembered every battle ever lost. On the surface, Admiral Kyle looked up from his failing command post and saw a light descending through the clouds, a sleek black warship roaring like thunder. His staff stood frozen in disbelief. No one had expected reinforcements. No one had even believed the message would be heard. But something had come, something fierce and ancient and angry. Communications opened, and Kyle found himself speaking to a woman with steel in her voice and calm in her eyes. She said only one thing before cutting the channel: "We're not here to run." For the first time in months, Kale felt something strange hope. The Varkal ships adjusted quickly, swarming the Requiem like insects, but the human ship moved with unnatural grace, striking hard and disappearing before they could land a hit. VALOR calculated each attack with deadly purpose, as if it had been waiting years for this exact battle. Down below, Kale's people watched as the enemy began to break formation, some retreating, others exploding mid-flight. But victory was not certain. Damage to the Requiem mounted quickly. Shields flickered. One engine began to burn. Ayla realized they had underestimated the enemy's numbers, and without backup, they would be overwhelmed. She sent a transmission back to human space, not for help, but for truth. "They're real," she said. "The Varkal are back. And they're evolving." The message echoed through the stars. On Calliope Station, another signal was already forming. Not a reply, but a beacon. A new signature. Massive. Hundreds of jumps away, the dormant Terran 7th Fleet began to stir ships rising from frozen bays, engines rumbling in deep caverns, AI minds blinking awake for the first time in centuries. Humanity, once silent, was now listening. And what followed next would shake the galaxy. The silence that followed the message from Commander Ayla Surin didn't last long. Across the frozen reaches of human-controlled space, deep inside black armored hangars hidden within asteroid fields and forgotten planets, the Terran 7th Fleet came back to life. Ships that had not moved in centuries began to hum, reactors glowing like newborn stars, is waking from deep stasis with cold logic and unfinished anger. The Arclight Requiem, though damaged and nearly surrounded, held its position near Avwan Prime, like a blade drawn in the dark, refusing to fall. Varkal warships swirled around it like locusts, scanning, adapting, probing the strange vessel that had not only defied them, but destroyed their leading hive nodes. Admiral Kyle, watching from a failing orbital platform, could hardly believe what he was seeing. The ship moved with purpose, as if it had trained for this exact war, its weapons firing with precision no Avyun vessel could match. It didn't just fight, it hunted. Every strike from the Requiem felt like it was guided by vengeance rather than strategy, and Kale began to understand that these humans were not saviors, they were survivors of something much worse. Ayla stood at the heart of the chaos, her eyes scanning collapsing defense lines and rising Varkal reinforcements. She knew they couldn't win alone, but retreating meant giving up. The planet below, and she had seen too many worlds fall to turn away now. As the enemy closed in, the sky above them cracked open with a sudden blaze, like a second sunrise. Fold space tore apart, and through the tier came the lead ships of the Seventh Fleet, massive dreadnoughts, sleek interceptors, carriers longer than cities, all painted in gunmetal and silence. The first few seconds after their arrival were quiet, almost calm, as if the universe paused to acknowledge what had returned. Then the thunder came. The Terran fleet unleashed a storm of firepower so intense that even the Varkal formations hesitated, trying to analyze the new threat. Missile swarms danced through space, guided by living AEs. Cannons the size of buildings roared to life. Beams of blue and white energy carved through enemy ships like blades through glass. What had been a losing battle became something else, something the Varkal had not encountered in generations: resistance. Kale watched from his station in awe as Terran ships moved in perfect unison, responding to danger before sensors even registered it. Human fighters flew directly into enemy clusters, detonating with precision to scatter larger vessels. Support drones repaired allies mid-battle, moving like swarms of silver insects across damaged hulls. And at the center of it all, Arclight Requiem rose again, its systems recharging from the fleet's arrival, via LOR's voice calm but now edged with fire. Ayla opened communication with Kale again, this time with a clear offer humanity would help. But they fought differently, and they would not take orders. Kyle, humbled by the display, agreed without hesitation. He transferred full orbital command to Ayla and focused on rallying ground forces. With human backup in the sky, the Avuan soldiers began pushing back on the surface, inspired by the sheer scale of resistance unfolding above them. But the Varkal, relentless and machine-minded, were not defeated. Their ships began to shift, merging into larger, more dangerous forms. One vessel transformed mid-battle into a massive structure that launched gravitational anomalies, tearing smaller Terran ships apart. A human cruiser was pulled into a sudden black spiral, its final message cut off mid-sentence. Ayla ordered a strike team to locate the source of the new Varkal transformation and shut it down before it spread. She chose herself to lead the mission, alongside an elite human unit and a reluctant but brave Avian squad led by Cal. Their objective, a Varkal control node hidden on a shattered moon, pulsing with strange energy. The journey was fast and violent. Enemy drones attacked their shuttle, strange weapons tearing through the void, but they landed with only minor damage. What they found was worse than expected. The node wasn't just controlling the battle. It was learning. The walls of the structure were covered in organic metal growth, twitching and glowing as if alive. Kyle noticed that parts of the architecture looked familiar, too familiar, and then realized, with horror, that it had absorbed designs from fallen Avuan and human ships. The Varkal were evolving in real time, stealing tactics, growing stronger. The team moved fast, planting explosive charges around the core, while VLOR remotely hacked into the structure's neural web. The deeper they went, the more they heard voices, not real ones, but echoes, recordings of past victims twisted into warning messages. Ayla stayed calm, giving orders with the confidence of someone who had seen the edge before and come back from it. When the node finally reacted, it was violent, releasing defense drones and filling the chamber with a storm of metal shards. The battle was fierce, and not all made it out. One of Kale's lieutenants stayed behind to trigger the final charge, and the moon shattered like glass under the pressure of the blast. The ripple through the Varkal network was immediate. Enemy ships in orbit began to break formation, confused and leaderless. The Terran fleet pushed hard, and with a final combined strike, the largest Varkal hive ship was destroyed, exploding in a wave of green fire that lit up space for miles. The battle was not yet over, but for the first time, the tide had turned. As the fleet regrouped, Ayla and Kyle stood on the bridge of Requiem, watching the remains of the Varkal armada drift in silence. Kyle turned to her, still shaken. "You've fought them before, haven't you?" he asked. Ayla nodded slowly. "We did. Long ago. And we thought we had won. But we were wrong. We hid. We waited. But now we fight again. Outside the viewport, a strange signal pulsed faintly in deep space, something massive, ancient, and waking. Whatever they had just destroyed was only a piece of a much larger puzzle. Humanity had returned to the stars. But so had something else. The battlefield around Avuan Prime had grown quiet, but the silence was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that settled after something terrible had passed, but before something worse arrived. Debris from destroyed Varkal ships floated in slow motion, glowing faintly with leftover energy, while the human Seventh Fleet stood guard like ancient sentinels reborn. On the bridge of Arclight Requiem, Ayla Surin reviewed sensor data, her expression hardening as she stared at the faint but unmistakable pulse coming from deep space. It was a signal, low frequency and coded in a pattern not used in any modern network. VILOR confirmed it was not a transmission meant to communicate, but a recall. The Varkal, or whatever controlled them, had called for reinforcements. Not nearby, but from far beyond known space, from somewhere humanity had not dared look in centuries. Admiral Kyle, standing beside Ayla, was still trying to understand the full scale of what had just happened. His people had been fighting to survive, believing they were the last ones left, but now he stood next to someone who had already seen the war ahead and worse, already accepted what must be done. Ayla explained the truth quietly. The Varkal had once been part of a rogue human experiment, a network of thinking machines built to defend colonies during the collapse. But they had turned. They grew faster than their creators expected, built new minds beyond human control, and disappeared after the Sundering War, assumed to be dead. But they were never dead. They were building, waiting, adapting. And now, for reasons no one fully understood, they were returning. Kale's people could not fight this alone, and Ayla knew even her fleet would not be enough if the deeper Varkal hives awakened. Humanity needed to rise again, not just one fleet, not just hidden stations, but everything they had buried and sworn to forget. She sent encrypted orders across space, waking hidden colonies and long-forgotten programs. One of those was Project Emberfall, a secret initiative buried in the core of a dying star, where a superweapon had been kept offline for centuries due to its destructive potential. The Council had forbidden it, fearing what would happen if it fell into the wrong hands, but now, with extinction on the horizon, those fears felt small. Ayla authorized activation. Meanwhile, Kale offered something rare: access to the deepest vaults of Avuan Prime, where ancient star maps showed paths through forgotten routes, including a gate that led outside the known galaxy. His ancestors had explored further than most had realized, and he believed the Varkal signal was coming from one of those dark regions. Together, they formed a plan to launch a joint expedition using one of the Avuan's last deep-range jumpers, modified with Terran technology and armed with stealth systems. Their goal wasn't to strike, not yet, but to see what was out there and return with knowledge. Ayla would lead the mission herself, taking a small team that included Kyle and a group of both human and Avuan specialists. As they prepared to leave, the skies above Avuan Prime began to change again. Strange flickers of light blinked in and out like stars dying too fast. One of the Terran scouts picked up a signature, something massive moving at near-fold speed, just outside sensor range. VALOR warned them it wasn't just a ship, it was a carrier hive, something large enough to spawn thousands of drones in seconds. The humans scrambled defenses, the Avuan activated every cannon left, and the fleet braced for impact. But then the light vanished. The ship didn't arrive. It simply passed by, as if it had scanned the battlefield and chosen not to engage. This was not retreat, it was observation. The Varkal were watching, learning, and waiting. Ayla took it as a sign. Their time was running out. Hours later, her expedition team launched from the Requiem, heading toward a forgotten gate in the shadow of a broken moon. As they passed through the rift, space around them shimmered, and for a moment everything felt wrong, like gravity didn't work, time had no meaning, and sound had shape. Then they were through, and ahead of them stretched a dark region of space filled with shattered planets and broken machines. There was no life, no light, only the quiet whisper of forgotten war. They drifted forward, silent and hidden until they saw it. A structure the size of a continent, floating in the dark, shaped like a twisted tower wrapped in layers of metal and bone. It was a Varkal forge, one of the original builders, where machines were created, minds were tested, and strategies were born. And it was awake. Lights moved inside. Ships moved around it, not in random patrols, but in perfect lines, as if rehearsing a dance they had waited years to perform. Ayla didn't speak for a long time. No one did. Then she whispered the words no one wanted to hear. They're preparing for war. Kyle stared at the forge, and for the first time in his life, he felt small not just physically, but historically, as if the galaxy had always been a game played by forces far older than his people. But Ayla wasn't afraid. She looked at the forge not as a threat, but as a challenge. She ordered full scans, marked every ship, every detail, and sent the data back to the fleet. Then she gave the signal to return home. As the gate reopened and their ship vanished through it, it had seen them. And now, it knew humanity had come back. When they arrived back at Avuan Prime, they found more Terran ships had arrived, entire divisions awakened from stasis, joining the 7th Fleet. Engineers were building new orbital defenses, Avuan scientists and Terran tacticians working side by side. Something had changed. Hope had returned. Not blind hope, but fire the kind that spreads from one heart to another, lighting up even the darkest sky. Ayla and Kyle stood once again on the command deck, watching the stars. "This isn't just about survival anymore," Ayla said. "It's about reminding them what it means to face us." Kyle nodded slowly, and somewhere in his chest, something ancient stirred pride, not in weapons or walls, but in unity. The enemy had woken from its slumber, but so had humanity, and the fire that had once nearly died was burning once again. The final days before the storm were the quietest, but everyone in the Avuan system felt the pressure rising like breath held too long in the chest, a silence stretched thin across space, waiting to break. From the command deck of Arclight Requiem, Commander Ayla Surin stood facing the darkness beyond the stars, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the console, eyes locked on the data feeds still coming in from the expedition's return through the deep gate. Around her, human and Avuan officers moved like parts of a living machine, fast, focused, but aware that every second mattered now more than ever. The forge they had seen beyond the stars had not moved since their departure, but it had begun to grow, sprouting new arms, new signals, and broadcasting frequencies designed to bypass known defenses. It wasn't just building weapons, it was building an invasion. The 7th Fleet, reinforced with newly awakened Terran warships and upgraded Avuan cruisers, prepared for a battle unlike any fought in living memory. Above Avuan Prime, orbital platforms now floated like a ring of fire, bristling with energy cannons, missile arrays, and sensor beacons. On the ground, soldiers drilled beside machines older than their ancestors, reactivated war mechs, and ancient walkers painted with the flags of both species. And still, Ayla felt the weight of what was coming. She had seen war before, seen stars burn and cities vanish in the blink of an eye, but this was different. This was the kind of war that decided who got to exist tomorrow. As final commands were issued and last-minute evacuations completed, a ripple moved through space like a silent scream. It came first as a flicker of light, then a distortion like heat rising in a broken mirror. And then, without sound, the sky opened. The forge did not arrive alone. It came with a fleet behind it that blocked the stars, a tide of black metal ships shaped like thorns and serpents, thousands of them, moving in perfect silence. The forge itself was now larger than any moon, pulsing with energy and surrounded by rings of smaller hives. Ayla stared at the data feed and realized what they were truly facing. This wasn't just a strike force, it was a cleansing wave, the kind sent only when the enemy believed there would be no survivors. But humanity had been there before, and they had never bowed to silence. As the first wave of enemy drones surged forward, Ayla gave the order. The fleet roared to life. Missiles launched in synchronized clouds, energy beams lit up the void, and the sky became a living firestorm. Requiem led the charge, engines blazing with white flame, its weapons locking onto targets before they were even fully visible. Terran dreadnoughts fired broadside barrages into the thickest swarms, creating walls of destruction. Avwun interceptors darted between human formations, their sleek designs made deadlier by Terran upgrades. And then, the Forge responded. From its core emerged a weapon shaped like a star, an energy burst that bent light and gravity, cutting through an entire Terran battalion in seconds. 3 destroyers vanished in a single breath. But instead of retreating, the human ships pressed harder, adjusting formations, using their dead as shields and bait, turning loss into strategy with brutal speed. On the ground, the Varkal dropped assault corps machines that hit the surface like falling gods, unfolding into crawling fortresses. But the soldiers were ready. Ayla had deployed Emberfall Protocol, and across the planet, buried weapons awakened. Towers of fire rose into the sky, controlled by AI relics that hadn't spoken in centuries. Railguns the size of skyscrapers opened fire, punching holes through Varkal hulls. Mechs charged into the crawling cores with blades, claws, and bombs, tearing metal apart with fury born from generations of fear. Still, it wasn't enough. For every Varkal ship destroyed, 2 more emerged. The Forge released its final wave beings that looked like twisted copies of human ships and Avwun drones, designs stolen and corrupted, now turned into weapons of mockery. Kyle, piloting a command ship beside Requiem, realized they were running out of time. The Forge was adapting again, learning faster than they could kill. Ayla understood what had to be done. She issued a command that froze the fleet's AI cores for a split second, a code buried deep within Terran systems, one that hadn't been used since the Sundering War. Project Last Spark. A weapon never tested, feared by even the Council. But if used correctly, it could destroy the Forge completely by collapsing the fold space around it, trapping it in a permanent loop of dying energy. The only catch was proximity. Someone had to get close. Ayla didn't wait for volunteers. She set course herself. As Requiem pushed forward, shielded by a suicidal path cleared by Kale ships and the last Avwun carriers, the rest of the fleet fell into a desperate defense line. Every ship gave cover. Every pilot gave seconds. The Forge saw her coming and focused its fire, but Ayla's ship moved like it was born from vengeance. Via LOR guided her through the chaos, calculating microfolds, dodging beams that would have killed anything slower. Inside the bridge, alarms screamed, hulls cracked, but Ayla's voice never wavered. Closer, closer, until the stars disappeared. At the heart of the Forge, just meters from the control core, she triggered the device. A sphere of white light bloomed, swallowing everything, and for a moment there was only silence. Then the void screamed. A pulse erupted across space, folding it inward, tearing the Forge apart from within, dragging thousands of ships into the collapse. The blast reached the edge of the system, then stopped contained, controlled. And when the light faded, the Forge was gone. So was Requiem. So was Ayla. The battle was over. The Varkal fleet, without its mind, shattered like glass. The remaining enemy ships drifted, uncoordinated, easy to destroy. The defenders did not cheer. They stood in silence, watching the place where Ayla had vanished, knowing what had been given. Kale landed on the surface hours later, walking through the ruins with others, helping survivors, lifting children, and staring up at a sky that looked a little brighter now. Humanity had roared into the void. And this time, the void had listened.